We go to the recipient of the Douglas Chalmers Award for the fall of 2025, Dr. Alexandra Birch, and she will be introduced in just a minute by Dr. Grogan. Let me just say that the competition for this award this semester was very intense. You had about 8 outstanding applications. And I want to thank the committee members who reviewed the applications, Chini Papinar, Don Belcito, and I think Heidi Rotterdam. I saw her come in just a minute ago. But although there was intense competition, Dr. Birch was unanimously chosen as the winner of the award. And so we really are delighted that you can join us, and we look forward to your introduction.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Coburn. I am the Russell and Bettina Knapp Professor of American Jewish History and the co-director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, and a member of the Harriman Institute, which is where I get to meet amazing postdoctoral fellows like you are going to be able to hear and listen to her music today. So I'm going to introduce Sasha Birch. But it is such a pleasure to be at an organization called EPIC. You are my future. So I'm very glad to be here. So Dr. Sasha Birch is the Mellon Teaching Fellow at the Harriman Institute and is a lecturer in history. She is a professional violinist and a historian who works comparatively on the Nazi Holocaust and Soviet mass atrocity, including imprisonment in the Gulag, using the lens of music and sound. She holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a BM, MM, and DMA from Arizona State University in violin performance. Previously, she was a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Wilson Center, the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, where she recorded and released CDs and finished her first and highly recommended Hitler's Twilight of Gods, Music and the Orchestration of War and Genocide in Europe. It actually won the Jordan Schnitzer Prize from the Association for Jewish Studies, which is the most esteemed prize in Jewish studies. Her current project, which she is now going to play for you from, is called Sonic Shatterzones, the Intertwined Spaces, Sound and Music of Nazi and Soviet Atrocity. It investigates 8 case studies of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union and the Gulag, and includes indigenous interactions with the Solovki. And she has new recordings. She has gone to Tashkent. She's gone to Kazakhstan. She's gone to Auschwitz to record and understanding how music and sound fits into this history of the Holocaust, in many ways humanizing what is incomprehensible violence. So I'm going to hand over to Sasha. I hope you all enjoy. It is a rare treat to have a concert and a lecture in the same time, but that is what you are going to be able to indulge in now. So, Sasha.
Well, thanks so much for having me today. And it's a pleasure to speak with all of you and share some of this research and also some of the recordings in real time. I really appreciate the invitation to speak. All right. 80 kilometers from Dalinka, the administrative seat of the largest gulag in Kazakhstan, I placed a small ambisonic recorder inside the ruin of a building in a village 20 kilometers from the nearest road. I patiently captured the sounds of the isolation cell, finally somewhat sheltered from the howling wind of the steppe. Who was tortured here? Who was consigned to the mining and military constructions nearby? I know that one of the composers I discovered was briefly interned in Kazakhstan. Is it possible that he was here? Or rather, using his valuable pianistic hands to clean up parts of the nearby nuclear test site at Semipalatinsk, as he had in Magadan? How could we possibly understand the experience of mass atrocity, genocide, and detention in the camps of the Soviet Union and the Third Reich? The day after I returned from conducting fieldwork in Kazakhstan, I performed Victor Ullmann's violin sonata and an event commemorating 85 years since Kristallnacht in Vienna. I recovered Ullmann Sonata, and while he is well known as a composer associated equally with Arnold Schoenberg and later the Theresienstadt camp, I felt a familiar disconnect in performing his music and his work. How can we hear the Holocaust that Ullmann experienced when performing his music? And better, should we? Music, like the pre-war sonata of Ullmann, allows composers to speak for themselves, to be recognized as intellectuals and for their artistic contributions rather than for their victimhood. I have long advocated as an artist for the inclusion of so-called musical Stolpersteine or tripping stones in the classical canon, works which have been forgotten, or erased composers that we can give equal credence to the Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, which are regularly programmed. However, how can we truly understand the spaces of atrocity that these composers perished, or which they survived? How does the meaningful restitution and performance of suppressed composers' works address the tragedy and mass death within the USSR, without also listing grim body counts or impossible prison conditions? Finally, besides working with musical compositions, what can sound illuminate about sites of atrocity, and can sound prioritize other understandings, other knowledge systems to address mass death? My research combines my own original recordings of soundscapes of the Gulag and Holocaust with 8 CDs of music, which I recovered and performed. Together, these recordings and sound provide an instant humanizing understanding of these sites and reveal the entangled intersections between Nazi and Soviet atrocity. So we have here some of the pictures from my fieldwork. This is the endless open steppe in Kazakhstan in the middle. Here is all that remains of the synagogue in Tarnów, Poland, which is just the bima, kind of the central place for Torah reading. It's preserved by the European Commission. And here's a set of Stolpersteine, the so-called tripping stones, or micro-memorials to the Holocaust, as I found actually on my way to a Brahms rehearsal when I was in northern Germany. Okay. So how can we hear mass atrocity? I propose 4 levels of understanding a site. First is the literal hearing of a space. So ambisonic or 360-degree recordings, rather than a directional recording like this with a microphone, provide an immersive sound world, similar to applications in VR or video games, and can be integrated into mapping and GIS applications. These recordings are also testimonial, with the potential to document unaltered indigenous perspectives of land and space, document diverse locations like the many sites of the Holocaust across the USSR, and are authentic without interpretation, as in my sound recordings of Auschwitz. This is particularly important in dealing with genocidal sites, as they don't have the potential for being edited or for denial. The second and third levels are music which aestheticizes, but still interprets a site. Composers like Emil Levand, Sergei Prokofiev, Dmitry Shostakovich, Suleiman Yudakov, and Mieczysław Weinberg musically reproduced sounds like trains, bullets, or preserved fragments of melody from the event. These works are contemporary to the event, but are a level removed from sound recording, as they are aesthetic documents, ego documents, like diaries, and vital to understanding musicians caught in the concentration camp nexus. Finally, there are reactionary works composed by composers who survived or who are in the second or third generation removed from the Holocaust. Today, I'll discuss only the sonata I recovered of Victor Ullmann, who was murdered at Auschwitz, and how such works can be used in commemorative practice. The ability to add an applied component to this research brings it out of the academy into a far wider audience, while simultaneously diversifying the archives of atrocity studies and of classical music. Music is a living art form and contains within hidden and community-encoded signifiers. This is a way to bring esoteric research back to the very people affected by violence and to engage with communities on their own terms by preserving and promoting internal and prized knowledge. Okay, so why the Holocaust in the USSR? So we are basically dealing with known versus new narratives of the Holocaust. So if we've taken a class in the Holocaust or read survivors' memoirs, engaged with film, the narrative that we're often told is one of rights rapidly being stripped away, particularly in Central Europe, of ghettoization, of forced deportation to the east, and then of the killing sites mostly of occupied Poland. So this would be Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, and so on. That's what the map here on the left represents. So this is taken from the United States Holocaust Museum Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, and the dots are proportional to the scale of the camp. So larger dots are larger killing or labor centers, including, for example, Auschwitz in the south. And And these are kind of the known sites of the Holocaust. With the opening of the Soviet archives in 1991, really in 1994, what we found is there was Holocaust preceding the Holocaust in camps, that we refer to as the Holocaust by bullets, which provided the methodological template and also kind of a murderous template for the Third Reich before the camps were even opened. So what you see on the right is recent mapping from an organization called Yahad and Unum, which means Together in One. And they have gone around taking field work all across the former Soviet Union, taking testimony of mostly bystanders. And these sites are not proportional to the scale. So the dots are not proportional. So one dot could be 33,000 people killed, as in the case of Babi Yar. It could be 45,000 people killed in the case of Bogdanovka. It could be 10 people killed in a regional village. So you really start to see what you don't see in the map on the right is any of the camps and ghettos from the map on the left. So you really start to get a sense of the tremendous scale of the Holocaust beyond camps. Yes.
What year specifically would that focus on?
So starting from June 22nd of 1941, all the way through the Nazi retreat in 1944. Yes.
What's the difference of the different colors? On the right side, red and blue, and on the left side, what?
So on the left side, it's a key from the U.S. Holocaust Museum debating if they were forced labor, if they were under whose jurisdiction, for example, the General Gouvernement versus like Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And on the right, it's just a digitization versus not digitization. It has nothing to do with scale or anything like that. What we also get with this is an expanded sense of survivorship and also victimization when we look at the Holocaust in the USSR. So what about sole survivors who fled into evacuation, for example, in Central Asia? What about crimes against Soviet citizens, like the blockade of Leningrad? The disproportionate murder of Soviet POWs, survivorship in partisan brigades, and even survivorship in the Red Army. So we get an expanded sense of who's surviving or who was killed in the Holocaust. So let's look at those first categories. The Great Patriotic War and the Holocaust in the USSR are inescapably linked. After Nazi Germany breached the Non-Aggression Pact on June 22nd of 1941, the war against the USSR was racialized and one of total elimination and destruction. The Bolshevism of the USSR wasn't only a counter-socioeconomic philosophy to that of the Third Reich, but one thought to be controlled by and filled with Jewish influence, from Karl Marx to so-called Stalin with the Jews behind him. With more than 34 million soldiers serving in the Red Army, the fatality rate for Soviet POWs approached 57% at conservative estimates, compared with the 3 to 5% total mortality rate of all other Allied POWs. One enormous problem with the study of Soviet POWs is the lack of knowledge around their deaths in decentralized burial sites across the former USSR. Furthermore, the methodologies used to murder Soviet POWs were later institutionalized in the concentration camp system to murder the civilian Jewish population. My second book contains a chapter on these crimes against Soviet citizens and soldiers, combining both ambisonic sound recordings with aesthetic interpretations of catastrophe. So what you have here on the top is a picture of the ash mound at Majdanek concentration camp, which is, by recent estimates, about 50% about Jewish fatality and 50% POW fatality at Majdanek. We don't have great numbers from the POWs murdered there. And what we have on the bottom is the field of ash, which is buried at Auschwitz-Birkenau, specifically of POWs, which is where I took a sound recording. So the sound recording that you'll hear is from there. And I'm going to let you hear, this is just a contemporary sound recording. It's oddly tranquil. I'll click in a little bit because it's... This disconcertingly quiet bird song and oddly still grass, which for high summer in Poland was a they of course still experience. Now, to combine with this sound recording, eventually my sound recordings are going to be incorporated into a VR map, so an immersive experience for people who want to look around the Auschwitz site, so visitors from abroad, for example. But in the book, it's combined with a more aesthetic interpretation of this leaf blowing through the grass, because although, yes, I can show you a testimonial recording, it's not particularly aestheticized to listen to. So how is this addressed kind of in Soviet musical culture, this leaf blowing through the grass, through the graveyard, and specifically something that we can use for POWs? The first violin sonata of Sergei Prokofiev was composed during the war and has a brooding and depressive character throughout. A particular theme used in the first, third, and fourth movements musically paints a leaf blowing wistfully through an unknown graveyard. One of the striking sights of the murder of Soviet POWs is this open field, where 12 to 15,000 bodies and ashes are interned at Auschwitz-Birkenau, otherwise known as Auschwitz II, of the three camps. I combined my own contemporary sound recordings of the wind through the grass, and one of the only known burial sites of Soviet POWs, and the early gas chambers of Soviet POWs at Auschwitz II, with a new recording of Prokofiev's violin sonata. This creates a living memorial to the Holocaust, addressing Soviet POWs' experiences at Auschwitz rather than Jewish memory of the site, and utilizes the wartime composition of Prokofiev like a musical Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So he writes this beautiful theme, which is supposed to be like a leaf blowing through the graveyard. He also employs a mute for the violin, so instead of a nice open sound, right, it's a little bit more subdued. So it tones the violin down a little bit, and we end up with this. This is Prokofiev's version of an aestheticized graveyard. From this, because it's a sonata for violin and piano, is the beautiful bell tones of the piano underneath it. In the third movement, Prokofiev brings this back again with a mute, but this time the blowing leaf through the graveyard fades into a beautiful and mournful theme, which actually was performed at Prokofiev's own funeral. So Prokofiev uses it in a couple of ways, and together with the sound recordings and juxtaposition, it provides a nice musical memorial to the Soviet POWs who otherwise don't really have a centralized memorial space, at least in regards to the Holocaust. There's increasing attention to the plight of There's increasing attention to the plight of evacuated Jews also as a dimension of Holocaust survival, and to understand post-war anti-Semitism. Mieczysław Moshe Weinberg is a familiar figure in Soviet music, best known in Holocaust studies for his opera The Passenger, which features an unnamed concentration camp. Typically, people think it's Auschwitz. Lesser known is Weinberg's time in Tashkent and the effects specifically on his violin writing from this period. I contrast the first of Weinberg's sonatas for violin and piano, which was composed in 1942. So it was composed during evacuation, with a work by Bukharian Jewish composer Suleiman Yudakov from the same time period in Tashkent. So this is a Central Asian Jew who was studying in Moscow and then was re-evacuated back to his homeland in Central Asia. In the case of Yudakov, a synthetic influence of Soviet Ashkenaz music and Central Asian musical practice come together in one piece. While Weinberg nods to Solomon Mikhail's and the music of the Yiddish theater, his sonata is an exercise in cultural preservation and exile. Placing an Ashkenazi evacuee like Weinberg in dialogue with Yudakov changes assumptions about the prescriptive Yiddishization or acculturation of Central Asia, and alongside testimonial research reveals the interactions between evacuees and existing Jewish communities in the Soviet interior. So my research has actually taken me kind of across Central Asia, from Tashkent to Kokand and Samarkand in Uzbekistan, across the Kazakh steppe in his extensive time in Almaty to reconstruct motivations for evacuation, specifically to Central Asia, and the dynamic interaction of Ashkenazic evacuees with their Central Asian counterparts. What we see in the scores of Weinberg and Yudakov is a Yiddish renaissance and an exchange of culture. Weinberg specifically commemorates and acknowledges his friend and father-in-law, Solomon Mikhails, and Yudakov reimagines Bukharian shashmakam music for the Western violin and piano. So the Weinberg Sonata is particularly touching because he composes it in evacuation. He intends to have it premiered in 1946. And then when he returns to Moscow, he's a Polish composer, Polish-Jewish composer, but working primarily in the Soviet Union. When he returns to Moscow in 46, he's faced with anti-Semitism, both post-war anti-Semitism, but also specifically related to evacuation. And Jews who are so-called hiding behind the front are treated with great suspicion, and his sonata is not premiered. It's dedicated to his father-in-law, the great Yiddish theater actor Solomon Mikhails. And the second movement, which quotes the background music from Mikhail's most iconic play, which is King Lear, so the diegetic music from that, he quotes it, but he slows it way down and makes it a personal elegy for Mikhail's. And we know that the sonata was never premiered. Mikhail's was later assassinated by the Inquisitor in 1948. Weinberg was denounced in 1948. This becomes a really poignant melody, both in tribute to Mikhail and kind of this Yiddish Renaissance in exile, but also to like Jewish Soviet anti-Semitism, like all of these entanglements after the war. So here's the beautiful opening of the second movement of Weinberg's Sonata. The phrase for you. So that we don't kind of feel an incompleteness. But actually, throughout the sonata, he tends to kind of highlight these endings, like they're not really finished. And so the phrases always leave us kind of going, oh, I was just ready to settle into that. Like, what is going on? So there's a feeling of very incomplete writing in Weinberg's work, which I think also speaks to his precarity in the post-war, right? It's something a little bit, reading a little bit of ego into his writing. The other piece by Yudakov. So Yudakov's a Central Asian Jew. He was born in Kokand, actually in an orphanage. He was educated in Moscow. He was then evacuated during the war back to his homeland, back to Central Asia. And what's interesting is his piece could sound very exotic. It could sound like something, oh, he's kind of affecting Central Asia, Orientalism or something, but it's not exotic. It's his culture. And rather, he's taking the inspiration from evacuated Ashkenazi Jews and writing this for violin and making it something more palatable to a Western audience. It's like self-representing Orientalism almost. So this is the opening of Yudakov's piece, which he just kind of mysteriously titles Eastern Poem, but it could be an allusion to many things. It's also from the 1940s. It's from 1946. So here's the very opening. So it's very reminiscent of like Scheherazade, something like that. He also writes a beautiful cadenza for the violin later. Virtuosic, it's very in the style of Western violin writing. It also alludes to the style of virtuosity composed by Bulgarian Jews within the community, which is something called Shashmakam ensemble. And he's evoking this for the Western violin, which I think is really interesting, especially in the 1940s, right? Especially something where you have all of these interactions with his kind of Ashkenaz interlocutors from Western Europe. Or I guess from Eastern Europe for us, but Western Soviet Union for him. All right. So what about other evacuees during the war? Another evacuee, Soviet Gulag, returned to Ukraine after the war and began composing a violin concerto in a romantic style, recalling Tchaikovsky and Glazunov from a half-century prior. So Zabludovsky had carried sonic fragments of Central Asia and the Siberian Far East in his mind from evacuation during the war, and also from his earlier detention in the Gulag in Magadan. So this is in the very far east, north of Vladivostok, so like very far north and east in the former Soviet Union. During his detention, he was the first composer since Bach to compose a set of preludes and fugues for piano nearly 20 years before Shostakovich did so. He accomplished this even without an instrument and with extraordinary odds while in the camp. He was mining uranium with his bare hands. So this gives you an idea of what this man was doing. Unable to write officially or perform these pieces in the camp, Zabludovsky carried fragments he composed home and finished the entire cycle before the outbreak of World War II. Interred in the Svetstolag near the Negev Bay, Zabludovsky was mining materials, often with his bare hands, including gold and uranium, so his feat of writing a piece for the piano is especially poignant. Playing an envisioned instrument at night, trying to move his hands over imagined keys, or futilely working with a callus-making sieve every day, breaking down the hands of this concert pianist. Mentally, the combination of political prisoners with dangerous criminals also had a toll on Zabludovsky, a sharp contrast to his elegant and cultural upbringing and professional family in Ukraine, the classical conservatory education and the cosmopolitanism of Moscow. So how can we hear the Gulag in a violin concerto? It's clearer in Weinberg's music with a specific incorporation of musical fragments, like a direct allusion to Mikhail's, or in Prokofiev's wartime descriptions of a leaf blowing through an unnamed cemetery. For Zabludovsky, for his commitment to aesthetic, to a genteel, romanticized version of music, is perhaps a refutation of the aesthetic strictures of socialist realism. He held the quote, "Never a day without writing, an arduous path to the stars," as a personal talisman and motto through the Gulag and into post-detention denunciation and adversity. Scholarship on music and the Holocaust typically rejects a redemptive arc, where composers derive a source of strength or humanity within genocidal conditions from writing music. So we don't like to say, well, they survived because they were able to compose something, because they had this preservation of humanity, because often this was something which was not necessarily extraordinary to their character, just something where it provided solace, it provided relief, but there were many great artists, of course, who were unable to compose in the camps, who were unable to derive that same sort of solace, not from any personal fault of their own, of course. However, there are notable artists and authors who use their camp experiences in art, and for whom art directly contributed to their survival. So in the case of the Holocaust, this would be pianist Alice Herz-Sommer, who survived Terezin, the violinist Anna Rosé, who was murdered at Auschwitz. She was the head of the women's orchestra. And then on the Soviet side, the authors Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Valentin Shalamov, who lyrically documented the Gulag. Zabludovsky belongs to this category, an artist who took solace in composition and continued to compose every day against extraordinary odds in the Gulag. His violin concerto, the last composition before his death, actually composed the same year as Stalin, which is part of Stalin died, 1953, which is part of the problem with its reception. It's a piece of its own making, incorporating his experiences and inspiration from Orientalist music of the Far East and of his time in Kazan during evacuation, but resplendent with romantic flair, violinistic virtuosity, and Franco-Russian aesthetic, down to the movement titles. All the movement titles are in French. They're all things that you might expect to associate with like Russian ballet, like a dance of spring or an oriental melody, a poem of spring. It's all these beautiful kind of French-Russian allusions. Zabludovsky's concerto from 1953 gives us another model to consider commemorative or atrocity works. Was he a veteran? Yes. Was he a Gulag survivor? Yes. Was he an evacuee? Yes. So it kind of shows you the interactions of all of these different possibilities for for existence amongst mass atrocity in the Soviet Union. I think that the movement from the melody from the second movement is particularly striking in this. It's kind of this Orientalist fantasy. He writes, it's a Oriental poem, he writes. And what's interesting is there's beautiful harp underneath the violin melody in the orchestra. So it's for violin and orchestra. And the violin melody is absolutely beautiful. So I'll play just a little bit of that for you. Just kind of goes on. It's interspersed with these beautiful cadenzas. The first movement is kind of a more brash and exciting introduction, which you would expect in a violin concerto. You would expect to open with a lot of fireworks, but this is kind of how he starts the piece. Goes on and on. It's very virtuosic for the violin. And what's interesting about it is it sounds really like Glazunov or something from the late 1800s. It does not sound like it was composed in 1953. It does not sound like it's Shostakovich violin concerto, Prokofiev's second violin concerto, which is from the late 40s. It really has a sentiment of something late Romantic, Orientalist from Imperial Russia. And that's something which is also echoed in his family narratives. So in working with his grandson and his son is an eminent musicologist in Moscow. His grandson, actually, all of that side of the family now lives in France. And so in working with them, he was very committed with maintaining this romantic aesthetic, something which wasn't rooted in kind of these socialist understandings, socialist realism, I guess, aesthetic, right? So it's something which wasn't Sovietized. And that was very important to him. And that was important to him to maintain after being interned in the Gulag. Okay. So what about those who weren't able to evacuate? So what we have here is Emil Levand, and his piece is entitled, it's covered a little bit by Zoom, but A Poem About the Holocaust. What we have on the left is an image of Babi Yar, which is the site of mass execution near Kiev in Ukraine, and on the right, Emil Levand, the composer. So how can we read their music testimonially? What can we do with composers who were maybe survived the Holocaust, but their family was killed? And Emil Levand is an excellent example. So Emil Levand was a Soviet Jewish violinist. He immigrated to the United States in 1990. He subsequently made a small donation to the United States Holocaust Museum that consisted of one score in his own handwriting and a cassette tape of his music. And it was listed in the family collection and wasn't found until I dug it out in 2017. And the son, I was able to find his living son, who lives in Indianapolis. First of all, didn't know his father was a Holocaust survivor. Didn't know that he had given anything to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, or that he had written the piece. What's interesting is that Levand's piece sonically documents the Holocaust in Ukraine. So it preserves a fragment of melody. He was from Balta, so near Odessa, in the south, and he preserves a fragment of cantorial melody, and then he interrupts it throughout. So the piece builds this beautiful climax, and he actually interrupts a very plaintive version of this melody with what he represents as musical gunshots. And I'm going to play first the melody, and I'll just talk through the piece a little bit. It's about a 7-minute piece. One of the other things that's really interesting about it is that Levand, he survived as a sole survivor from his family. So his entire family was murdered in the Holocaust. He survived by joining the Red Army and was then sent to Moscow to do his training. And they said, you know what, you're a really poor shot, but you're quite good at playing the violin in the evenings and entertaining people. So after spending like a week at the front, they sent him back to Moscow. He ended up joining a jazz band, actually Alexander Birch's jazz band, which was somewhat popular during the war. He had a much better time raising morale for the troops than he ever did shooting. He was just better at it. And it probably saved his life, right? Being sent back to Moscow. And he never talked about his experiences in the Holocaust. He never talked about his family being murdered. He fled from the mass shooting in Balta actually to join the Red Army. And the piece, as far as we can tell, was probably composed in the later Soviet Union, so like in the 1970s or 80s, prior to immigration, because he has a couple of revisions of it that were in his personal notes, but he never told his family about it. He never told anybody that he composed it. So it's kind of a private working through of trauma, right, is what we can see in it. And these documentary like pieces within it, the testimonial pieces within the music itself are really interesting. It's also a great piece of music. Not all the things that you find or recover are nice music, but because he was a professional violinist, it's pretty good for the violin, which is always great to find. So he starts with this cantorial melody. Well, he opens up kind of depressingly, and then he's going to resolve that for us by the end. So he finishes with optimism, which is nice. So here's how he opens the piece. So he set us up for the theme to come in. Then, a few lines down, he gives us this theme, which is a direct quote of a cantor singing from Balta. He gives us this theme a few times. He starts to embellish upon it. It builds to a giant climax in the middle of the piece. And then, after a moment of silence, he gives us this theme very plaintively again, but this time interrupted by what he describes as musical gunshots. The theme is completely evaporated into something a little bit more contemplative. At the very end, what I think is interesting is that he closes with optimism. So instead of the dissonant chords of the opening, he ends on a big triumphant G major chord. We have a sense of arrival, of perhaps victory, however you want to read that. So there is something optimistic with how he closes this very personal testament to the Holocaust. So here's the very ending. So there is something which feels very resolved and resolute about the piece as a whole. And that's how this composer chose to personally document his own experiences with the Holocaust. All right. And finally, what about those who were so unfortunate to not be able to immigrate, or who were not evacuated, or who otherwise did not have paths to survivorship? So after 1942, as you saw with the maps, the methodology of the Holocaust moved from the so-called Holocaust by bullets to the systemic murder in the Reinhard camps of Poland. So these are the camps with which we're most familiar: Auschwitz, Majdanek, and so on. In my first book, I discussed the use of music by perpetrators at length, from the Wagnerian delusions of the High Command to the musical sadism of the Eastern Front, which was institutionalized and codified in the concentration camps. Following the war, this creates a reckoning in classical music. How do we deal with the silenced composers? What is the process of so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, and at least in regards to the classical canon? Can we recover what was lost? Who was lost? And the cultural destruction of European Jews and Roma, as mentioned specifically in the trial of Adolf Eichmann from 1961. In addition to critical programming within the musical realm, I also want to leave you with a final piece by the composer Victor Ullmann, which directly shows the immeasurable loss of life and artistry in a single piece. So Victor Ullmann was a Silesian, a Czech composer. He tried very, very hard to get out of Czech Republic and immigrate to the United States. He was unable to do so. Most of his students were able to immigrate, so we have some of his scores. But he was deported to Theresienstadt in 1939, and then eventually to Auschwitz in October of 1944, where he was murdered by the Third Reich and their collaborators. This is actually a picture of the children's opera on which he worked with other composers like Pavel Haas at Theresienstadt, which has kind of been, it's a model camp. It was referred to as the antechamber of Auschwitz by contemporary Holocaust historians, and that it was kind of a show camp, a trial for like the International Red Cross to visit and things like this, but it wasn't really the reality of the Holocaust. So Victor Ullmann did have some productive years writing in Theresienstadt, most notably the satirical opera Der Kaiser von Atlantis, which is a parody about Hitler. It was not performed during the war. The violin sonata that he wrote is from 1939. And it was, we presumed it to be lost. There was an apocryphal sonata that showed up a few years ago that was labeled with his name, and it said that it was the so-called Auschwitz sonata. This is impossible. Victor Ullmann was in Auschwitz less than 10 hours. He had no idea of his fate going there. And so this is impossible. He would have written an Auschwitz sonata. What we do know is that was later attributed to one of his students. I knew that there was a violin sonata that existed. And after some digging around, I found it in an archive in Basel, in Switzerland. Now, unfortunately, that archive is locked, and they charge you like 95 euro to copy a page of any musical score. And by copy, they mean you're allowed in person with a pencil to write it down, not like they'll send you a nice PDF of it. What was fortunate for me is that the librarian who was in charge of those collections, specifically the Ullmann collection there, was a personal friend because I had worked with her on my DMA, on my violin doctorate. And so I wrote her and I said, I heard that there's an Ullmann collection there. Can you tell me about it before I get on the flight to Basel? And she said, sure. And the next email was a PDF of this score. And she said, you're welcome to perform it, but only you can perform it because we know that you're going to do the historical due diligence and tell people you have it, but don't give anybody the score. Great. So I opened the score, and unfortunately, fortunately, it's a fantastic piece. It's recovered. We know where it is. Great. It's Ullmann's handwriting. We know that it's his. All the provenance has been accounted for. What's unfortunate is that only the violin part remains. So it's a sonata for violin and piano, and we only have the violin part. So what do you do as an artist? Do you try to reconstruct it, right? Do you try to reconstruct the piano part? My instinct was to say no, because I think that there's some things that are lost in the war that this is the fallout of the war, right? We're lucky to have it, but this is part of it. So the silences are left into the middle movement. I perform the middle movement, it's a slow movement. And just kind of as like a private elegy, it's already slow. So there's nothing that needs to be done to slow it down. And I think that the silences should make us all a little bit uncomfortable, right? It's the things which were lost in the war, and the silences speak for themselves. So I'll play a little bit of Victor Ullmann before some closing remarks. Again, it's muted. It's a little bit creepy for the violin, but here's his sonata. very opening to the sonata. And I find that some of the silences, especially knowing that it's for violin and piano, feels like you're meant to answer a friend, right? Like you're meant how we collaborate in chamber music, and that friend is not there. It's something very poignant about the score, to just leave that in as it is. Right. So together, these works give us a more complete picture of the entanglements of victim categories from Soviet mass atrocity in the first part of the 20th century. Our composers, evacuees, survivors, victims, veterans, partisans, or some combination of it all. Music combined with sound provides an instant, immersive, and humanizing look at incomprehensible tragedy and helps us understand these points of intersection. Where does this musical analysis leave us today? And how have these cultures of memorialization advanced since 1991? The legacies of the Gulag, the Holocaust, the Soviet terror, and the Great Patriotic War continue to return in the iconography of post-Soviet society. The inability to grapple with the trauma fully, to speak openly about the atrocities of Stalin in the late Soviet period, has led to a warped mourning or a bizarre nostalgia compelled by an incomplete reckoning with the past. So I hope that provides some insight. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The video of the mind.
Oh, yes. And I'll try not to bump mine.
Well, as you mentioned, Theresienstadt was pretty much part of the Nazi propaganda machine to try to make themselves look good. But it was also a fascinating gathering collection, if you will, of a lot of the Jewish people who they felt had served a purpose for them, as opposed to just sending them to Bergen-Belsen or Auschwitz or somewhere like that. In the end, most of them were murdered anyway at the end. But what happened to those, to the productivity that they did while they were there? In other words, they were artists, they were musicians. Were they ever credited? Was any of that ever made public to with their credit, or did that all just go into the Nazi, became German and of Nazi origin?
Sure. So about productivity in Theresienstadt, yes, there's been a lot. I would say that's the focus. If you say that you do anything with music in the Holocaust, people have a reference point with Terezin, because there's been so much recovery specifically from that site. First of all, the children's opera Brundibar, now Ullmann's piece, Der Kaiser von Atlantis, has been actually staged in full, like a number of times. Composers like Pavel Haas, Pavel Haas, and Gideon Klein, Erwin Schulhoff, their music has been pretty widely disseminated. There's good commercial recordings of a lot of it. Most of it is pre-war, though. Most of it is not from the camp. What you see in the camps, and this is not only true with Terezin, but I think Terezin is the most clear example of it, is a kind of private-public dichotomy, right? So there's what the Third Reich is expecting them to produce and demanding that artists produce. This was also the case, for example, for the orchestras at Auschwitz, right? Like you have to produce concerts every day and so on. And then you see clandestine music making that's for themselves, like that's testimonial, that's cultural preservation, that's whatever that might be. So like if I'm looking at evacuation, I'm mostly looking at those documents. I'm looking at what composers are writing for themselves and yet less of like what they're writing for the Yiddish theater. That's been the focus of Terezin as well, is like what were artists like Ullmann writing to commemorate the camp or to discuss their experiences, not what the Nazis were forcing them to produce, which is generally of a lower artistic quality, as one would expect, right? One would expect like the music produced for the Nazis is not necessarily their best or like most inspired work.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit about hear me now? I'm always interested in the connection between the personal biography of someone and the intellectual life. So what I'm really asking you, can you talk a little bit about how you came to focus on this particular topic as an object of the work?
Oh, my personal biography. All right, sure. So I have an interesting family history. I'm German and also Soviet Jewish. So my mother's a Georgian Jew. My father is German, like Bavarian German. So I had, I suppose, the language skills growing up, right? With Russian and German. Also kind of both sides of the war. So I had parents who survived the war, grandparents who survived the war in evacuation and in the Red Army. My grandfather is an Armenian genocide survivor and then also was in the Red Army. And then also the perpetrator side, right? So my father's parents both fought in the Second World War for the Nazis. And so got a big, personal history, family history. I was also, like all good Soviet parents, my mother pushed me into violin when I was 2.5. Excellence was not a question. It was like, if you're going to do violin, you have to do violin well. So fortunately, I had musical access, like the ability to read musical scores and like years of training and all of those things. And I was on a fantastic fellowship in 2015, midway through my master's. I've been kind of performing a bunch of Jewish music, everything from Bloch to Schulhoff, some of these Theresian composers. And I went on this fantastic fellowship to the US Holocaust Museum about the Holocaust in the USSR and these specific research methods. And when I was there, their senior musicologist, who I'm forever indebted to, is a brilliant archivist, wonderful scholar. He said to me, we've got about 14,000 linear feet of uncategorized material. Oh, that's a lot of material, right? And so I started finding scores like this Levand piece that were in boxes that didn't match up. I found a violin sonata of Lev Abyolovich, who's a pretty big Soviet composer. Like he's a pretty recognized Soviet composer that we didn't know existed. It was like in a Holocaust scores box. And I said, this is a lot of fantastic material and a lot of really good classical music that yes, I still get to perform my Beethoven and my Brahms and my Schubert and all of those things. But what a great set of things to be able to incorporate and put on programs. So, and I needed the historical rigor to do it. So, much to my parents' dismay, I went back in and did another doctorate. So it's historically complete.
Yes.
First a comment and then a question. I think I can shout enough, but all right, thank you. All right. First comment. Ooh, it's too much. Okay, the first comment, it speaks to the strength of the human spirit that under these circumstances, people could do that.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to all of us. Hopefully we'll never have a Holocaust again, but difficulties do arise in everybody's life. Second comment, I guess we're all old enough to have experienced deaths of parents, of close friends and so forth. And so often I'm confronted with, before I die, I want to hear this. I want to hear this. Can you get me this? Music speaks to you, I think, more strongly if you are in a disaster or in a very, let's just say, very difficult situation. I question these composers, if they have any support within the setting wherever they lived at the time. Did they have a piano? Did they have a violin? They had paper and pencil, I suppose, to write music down?
Not so much. Yes. Well, first of all, yes, music is tremendously powerful, unfortunately also for perpetrators. So we know like musical sadism and the use, kind of imposed use of music on people is also really rampant, like in the concentration camp system, in the Soviet Gulag, like forced performances and things like this. So a lot of artists, they're saying, yeah, I was able to survive and I was a violinist the whole time I was in the Gulag. That wasn't necessarily great for them, right? And as we know, like from Arthur Gold, the great violinist who was murdered at Treblinka, or his daughter-in-law Alma Rosé was murdered at Auschwitz, it wasn't always a path to survival. But as far as what they were able to access, most of them were not musicians in camps or under duress. Weinberg was evacuated as an intellectual, so he was able to compose in evacuation. When he was like working for the Yiddish theater. So he had all of the resources, piano and orchestra and all these things. Zadaratsky was not, he was mining. So the way he was able to get even paper and a pencil was he would trade his ration books with a prisoner who was like a slightly higher ranking than him in the Gulag. And that prisoner gave him the back of stamps. So like when you have the stamp booklet, it would be the back of that. And he was writing these preludes and fugues for piano on the back of that. And that's what he took with him. Actually, he walked home from Vladivostok to Ukraine. So if you can imagine how far, like, right, when he got out. They often did not have really good access. And a lot of the pieces are then composed after the war in response, or the pre-war things, which I'm able to recover. Things from the camps are often fragments. They're not, I would say, of great musical value. They're of great personal value, certainly. But it's nothing that I can put together and perform in a concert, usually.
One more comment. You mentioned the Stolpersteine, and you recognize from my German accent. I was born and raised in Germany, so after the war. So die Stolpersteine in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Vienna, not
Yeah, of course.
you know that. Okay. Because the Jewish organizations in Europe said, oh, now the Germans want to step on us again. Now we are jumping over this.
Right.
What do you think about this?
So my father's from Munich, so I'm unfortunately a sad Bavarian, but yeah, I mean, there's something self-serving about this memorialization where it's not necessarily for the Jewish community, it's mostly to provoke, I think, German remembrance. And it's these stones are in the sites of former houses and businesses usually of Jewish families. So there's something which is arresting about it. I like this micro memorialization. But if it's not in every city, it doesn't really show the impact, right? So there's something which is a little bit self-serving. What I like is to make a musical version of this. So when you're listening, instead of going to a concert and you say, oh, it's the sad Holocaust concert, and let's sit through an hour of the bitter pill of, it's Schoenberg, and then it's Ullmann, and it's like all of this depressing music. Rather, I like to say, here's a concert of German music. And in this concert of German music, we're going to hear Wagner, and we're going to hear Brahms, and also Ullmann, because he's a German composer, right? And it gives legitimacy to these composers, and it kind of reincorporates them in this musical Stolpersteine, right? In this musical way of reintegration, I guess.
In defense of Munich, the documentation center is really amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you elaborate on Twilight of the Gods?
Sure. So that's my first book. It is, I started with the Hitlerian fixation on Wagner. So the opera, like the final opera is Götterdämmerung, right? Twilight of the Gods. And the book loosely follows the architecture of the Ring cycle. So the whole book goes through the first chapter. It's about the rise of National Socialism. It's entitled Das Reichgold. So like a play on Das Rheingold, right? The first opera of the Ring. The last chapter is about Götterdämmerung. It's the destruction. It's what the command was doing in the destruction of the war, in the final days of the war. It kind of tapers down like Ring itself does, like the opera does, into Der Erlösungsmotiv, which is the redemption motif, a question about what can we do with classical music and redemption, and a funeral march to discuss the death marches. So instead of them being death marches of people to their doom, a more dignified funeral march, like the funeral march of Siegfried in Ring. So it's a parallel between the Ring cycle and also the Nazi use of music. It's kind of what goes on through the whole book.
What do you mean by the Nazi use of music?
So we know that Hitler was very obsessed with Wagner. What I uncovered is that this was something which was not only confined to the command, so not only something where Wagner kind of Hitler had these personal delusions, but where it was a really integral part of his statecraft. So it was something where he would say, I'm going to model myself in the vein not only of Friedrich the Great, but also of Siegfried, of these great kind of Teutonic myths. And it was something very durable for him and the entire command until the end of the war. What's also interesting is the way that this trickled down into musical sadism during the Holocaust, hierarchies of perpetrators during the Holocaust, the types of musical books which were disseminated like to the Wehrmacht and to the SS. So they were disseminating like really weird Teutonic mythology to like the ordinary soldiers in France. And just these insane stories like Hermann Goering, before he gave the halt order at Dunkirk, right? So his famous halt order, decided to not pull the tanks off the beach, whatever. He went and he did 50 milligrams of heroin. Good, solid, good statecraft. And listened to all of Ring. That is a 9-hour opera. That is the most bizarre military policy, right? There's this really strange entanglement with Nazism and music that is far too durable, let's say, in warfare, right? I mean, if you heard this about an American general, right, that they went and did, first of all, like 50 milligrams of heroin, and then listened to like 9 hours of Dolly Parton, it's ludicrous, right? And so there's a very bizarre entanglement between like the functions of the high command, what trickled down to the ordinary troops, and how durable this was until the very end for the SS.
The gunshots in the base piece were very stunning.
Yeah, that's right.
Did he actually witness Babi Yar or?
He witnessed a mass shooting in Balta, so in Ukraine, but he wasn't near Kiev. He was near Odessa.
Yes.
So I imagine the denominator of what I'm asking is very small, but you mentioned the one composer who seemed to have survived the guilt, or the one who the family never even knew he was a Holocaust survivor. Did you ever look at the psychological and the musical, again, productivity of people who were Theresienstadt, or as opposed to people who survived Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, in those places, or people who evacuated east, wound up in detention camps or displaced person camps in Russia and in Austria, and the psychological and musical, productivity of the various subsets of survivors?
Sure. So, I mean, within survivor communities, I would say there's very few people who would, just statistically, who would have survived, for example, Theresienstadt, and not also survived like Mauthausen, Auschwitz. This is really unlikely. Most people were deported to killing sites in the East and then happened to survive also those, right? Also, I would not say that like if somebody was in evacuation, for example, they might have fled a mass shooting and then been evacuated, right? Very few people kind of have a sanitized or an easier survivor experience, I would say, right? Like people weren't really in a lesser camp or a less traumatizing form of survival than like what we think of as they were in Auschwitz or they were in Bergen-Belsen or they were in 6 camps and so on. So generally people have a pretty rough path to survival no matter how they're able to survive. What we do find is there's a difference in professionalism. So like if somebody was a composer who's evacuated as a composer, they had a very different survival experience and kind of path to reincorporating these elements in their music or in poetry or whatever their art might be than somebody who survived just by their own wits, by their own ability to survive. So a good example of this would be somebody like Yankel Wernick, who was a pre-war architect and like a very artistic architect. He was actually brought in to build Treblinka, build the death camp at Treblinka, and make the command look nice, like make the center for the command look nice. And after the war, he never returned to architecture, right? It was something where this was like impossible for him. He made models of the camp. He spoke about it. He wrote a memoir, but he would never return to his profession because it was something which was weaponized against him in the Third Reich. Whereas you see people who were then able to survive in perhaps more ideal conditions, wanted to continue providing testimonial documentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex.